Will you pray with me? God of insight beyond our own, and vision that extends beyond our horizons, be with us this day. Open our minds and our hearts to your precious word, and guide us in understanding. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, for you, O God, are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I got to thinking this week, earlier in the week, how interesting it is that in all of the scripture texts, when Jesus is going through the countryside with his disciples and they come to a place and someone is behaving quite oddly and out of character with the rest of the community, almost to a one, the proclamation that is made by the town folk is that that person is possessed. They have demons. There is something that needs to be exorcised from them. And time again, that's just what Jesus does. He sends legion into a herd of pigs and frees the man at Gethsemane. He exorcises those demons, those bad spirits from people he encounters along the way. And yet we get to this story. The story set in Jerusalem, the classic example of the outcome of Babel, the story we looked at a few weeks ago. The place that was the beginning of humanity being scattered all over the earth and coming with different languages, and Jerusalem is the place that over those centuries, so many of them have come back to. People from Parthian and Medes and the Elamites, and people from Mesopotamia and Judea and Cappadocia and Pontus and Asia and Phrygia and Pamphylia and Egypt and parts of Libya, the parts belonging to Cyrene, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, all of those names that I didn't make poor Tina read, those places all over with different languages. And they're gathered here in Jerusalem. And the disciples on that day, just as Jesus had foretold, were touched by tongues of flame. And they poured out into the street and they prophesied, speaking the words from the prophet Joel, although those who heard them didn't know that. Speaking those words of prophetic warning, reminding them that their young women would dream dreams and their young men would see visions. Actually, the old men would dream dreams. Their sons and daughters would prophesy. They poured out into the street, warning of the portents that would come from heaven. And I want to know why it was in that instant that the people who heard them did not assume that they were consumed by spirits, that they needed to have their demons exorcised. The best they came up with is they're probably drunk. Some piece of that might just be the difference between the simple people in the countryside and the cosmopolitan people in the city of Jerusalem. And some part of that may have been the authority from which they spoke, particularly when Peter stepped up and began to explain where it was these prophetic words came from and why it was that those people in Jerusalem were hearing them that day. I'm deeply affected. It's saddened in some sense, it's furious in others, that on this particular weekend, we are again dealing with tongues of flame. And this time it's coming from burning vehicles and burning buildings and piles of trash in New York City. And the CNN Broadcast Center in Atlanta, the streets of Los Angeles and Chicago and Minneapolis. And in the midst of that flame, there is both violence and prophetic voices. And on this particular morning, I would call on us to separate the two. As I was watching last night and this morning here in Rochester, where I am visiting my family right now, this is their dining room. My backdrop looks a little different. My parents were remembering that when they moved here in 1964, shortly before the race riots that forever changed the character of this city. And there's been a lot of progress since then. And our very talented African-American mayor last night imposed a curfew at 9 o'clock, not only for the city, but it was extended to all of Monroe County. Not because of the protests that had happened in the afternoon, those were peaceful, but because of the smaller contingent that stormed Union Square and burned police vehicles and defaced a monument to policemen who had fallen in the history of this city. And in city after city after city, similar things happened. I listed some of them: Minneapolis, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Seattle, Cleveland, Columbus, Portland, Miami, Milwaukee, Salt Lake City, and Rochester all had curfews imposed last night. Each experienced violence following, in so many instances, protests seated in anger and peaceful resistance to an untenable situation that our country has found itself in. There is a time to speak out. And in the history of human experience, when speaking out doesn't work, it is our inclination to act out. And when acting out is not fostering change, there is a tendency to lash out. And when lashing out is not met with response, human behavior is often led to strike out. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that in so many instances, but we're not seeing it everywhere. We didn't see it in Boston. There was some violence. Believe me, I checked early and often. We didn't see it in Hartford. There were thousands of people out all over this country who were taking positions of nonviolent response to what is at its core tremendous violence against people of color in this country. Jen, I'm not quite sure what happened, but I have you on the screen. We have to respond, and we have to figure out how. One of the speakers I saw on the Boston broadcast last night was a young white woman who said, "I'm here because this can't continue. But I'm here to listen because this is not a time for white people to talk, much less to tell Black people what their experience is and what they're feeling. This is a time for white people to listen. It is also a time to take what we hear and respond." A quote that is often attributed to Martin Luther King, but it has much deeper roots is the only thing it takes for evil to succeed is for good people to do nothing. If you've never listened to Martin Luther King's book, read it, but I've heard it in audiobook and it's so powerful. Letter from a Birmingham jail. It includes that quote and it stops your heart. Another quote that I've heard, if we are complacent, if we are silent, then we are complicit in the problem. And from Desmond Tutu, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. I watched the mayor of Atlanta this morning, Keisha Lance Bottoms, an African-American woman who stepped up after watching extended video of her city burning. In many instances being burned by the very people who are so damaged by what's happening in our deeply racially divided country right now. And she said, first off, I am a mother. And the first thing that I did when I started to get reports was I called my son and I said, where are you? Because this is no time for a young Black man to be on the streets. And she's right. And yet, if young and old, Black and white and Latino and people of good conscience do not speak out, and when it's called for, reach out, act out, and take a stand, this won't change. How many deaths, violent deaths, have we heard about over these past very few number of years? And you know it's gone back and gone back and gone back. And yet when a new distraction hits our media, we move on. It saddens me deeply that so much of the coverage, so many of the times that we hear what's happening is not until it becomes violent or becomes dangerous. Trevor Noah, who's known here mostly as a comedian and a talk show host, is also a product of South Africa, the apartheid system. And if you haven't read his book, Born a Crime, do it. It's worth reading. But his Twitter last night, I even looked at Twitter, and I am not a Twitter person, but his tweet last night, we've seen this in South Africa before. Beware of agitators and instigators who use legitimate protests to ignite chaos between protesters and police. There is something that needs to be said, and there is change that needs to be fostered. And we need to do it together. But we can't, we of the pale complexion, we of the privileged position, we cannot tell our brothers and sisters who are at the core most impacted by the injustice that we face in this country, that we have created in this country. We can't tell them what to do. We can stand together. And first off, we have to understand. Bill Ferguson, a colleague of mine, the pastor at the church in Duxbury, posted this, and I'd like to read it to you. It's not original to him, but I think it's profoundly important to hear. In the United States, because I am a human who happens to have white skin, I can do all these things without thinking twice. I can go birding. Remember Christian Cooper. I can go jogging Remember Ahmaud Arbery. I can relax in the comfort of my own home. Remember Botham Jean and Atatiana Jefferson. I can ask for help after being in a car crash. Remember Jonathan Farrell and Renisha McBride. I can have a cell phone. Remember Stephen Clark. I can leave a party to get to safety. Remember Jordan Edwards. I can play loud music. Remember Jordan Davis. I can sell CDs. Remember Alton Sterling. I can sleep. Remember Ayanna Jones. I can walk from the corner store. Remember Mike Brown. I can play cops and robbers. Remember Tamir Rice. I can go to church. Remember the 9 in Charleston. I can walk home with Skittles. Remember Trayvon Martin. I can hold a hairbrush while leaving my own bachelor party. Remember Sean Bell. I can party on New Year's. Remember Oscar Grant. I can get a normal traffic ticket. Remember Sandra Bland. I can lawfully carry a weapon. Remember Philando Castile. I can break down on a public road with car problems. Remember Corey Jones. I can shop at Walmart. Remember John Crawford. I can have a disabled vehicle. Remember Terrence Crutcher. I can read a book in my own car. Remember Keith Scott. I can be a 10-year-old walking with our grandfather. Remember Clifford Glover. I can decorate for a party. Remember Claude Reese. I can ask a cop a question. Remember Randy Evans. I can cash a check in peace. Remember Yvonne Smallwood. I can take out my wallet. Remember Amadou Diallo. I can run. Remember Walter Scott. I can breathe. Remember Eric Garner. I can live. Remember Freddie Gray. I can be arrested without the fear of being murdered. Remember George Floyd. White privilege is real. And the dangers of racism in this country are horrifying. And as our own police chief, Bill Quigley, posted just this week, there is no one who hates bad police more than policemen. We have a problem. And just as those in Jerusalem so many years ago poured out into the streets, not only lifting up the promise, but even more clearly lifting up the concerns. The authority of those voices came through because they stood in a place of grace. May we stand in a place of grace together to bring change. Will you pray with me? God, who knows our hearts and our actions, we are humbled. Even when in our own lives we gravitate toward the good and claim that which is just and right and ethical, we know we still have obligations to stand for justice beyond our own reach, to name evil when we encounter it, to bolster our brothers and sisters who are so impacted by systems that are neither their fault nor ours. But we turn to you, O God, to give us strength, to grant us courage, and to move us forward in love and in truth, to speak the truth to power, to resist oppression and evil in all its manifestations, and to stand for the right to live in peace and with justice in this world that you have given us to make yours.